people who receive advice can sometimes be, they can sometimes be in a situation where they feel that they're not being listened to enough. The government is doing a lot to support startups. It's very Dhaka focused, and those resources are not necessarily being accessed by people outside. There are these sort of disparities in the Advicescapes. So I think there's an issue about people being sold an unrealistic picture of what being an entrepreneur means and what a startup might offer. I mean, there's another quite interesting point. I remember reading something, I think it was from the Harvard Business School, about what they call triple strength leadership. And this idea that it's quite good for people who are in positions of perhaps starting businesses who have had some varied career experiences.
Thank you, Professor David, for being here. I have got a lot of questions for you, but today I'll limit my questions to the project that you and your amazing team are doing. And I was blessed to meet some of them, like Becky and Anjali, and I know you were super busy, but again, thank you very much for being with us today.
No, thank you, Rashid. It's a real honor and a privilege, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
Your work, the entire project takes a deep dive into the ethnographic solutions to the inequalities in South Asian Advicescapes. So there are a few reasons for which I'm quite intrigued about this topic. First reason is that as an organization, we strive, and our mission is to help enterprising youth to get into business and to tap into their unique potential so that they can help not only themselves but also their communities. But while doing that, what we have come across repeatedly is that there exists a persistent inequality in terms of the advice they are getting, and also the different support mechanisms. So what we believe that if there is an effective advice mechanism in place, the entire mission of us probably becomes a lot easier than it is right now. And there's another unique aspect to the work that you are doing is the ethnographic angle, which I believe is really quite unique one. Me being a student of both business and social science, I have always that belief that sometimes the business people needs to be a bit more human to some extent, so that we can take a deep dive into the culture and completely immerse ourselves to understand the different cultural nuances. And the reason for that is that if we don't understand culture, there will be a lot of surface level findings that we'll be working with, and it won't give us the solution that we want to have for a long term. So these are the few reasons for which I'm really excited about the topic that you are working on. So having said all of this, my first question to you is that, would you please provide an overview of the work that you are doing and why you believe that it is super important?
Yeah, thanks very much, Rashid. And you're right that anthropologists tend to want to dig a bit more deeply into not just into culture, but also into issues that might be less visible or might lie beneath the surface. And that's part of what we're trying to do. So background of the project. Many of us in the group have worked in South Asia for a while. And as you know, I've worked for many years on issues related to Bangladesh society and economy and politics. And one of the things that I've become interested in is the fact that in recent years, there's been a lot of effort to try to create effective entrepreneurial ecosystems in many South Asian countries. And entrepreneurship is seen as being important for contributing to economic growth and to strengthening people's livelihoods and to the empowerment of groups who are perhaps marginalized in society. So we've been thinking about these sorts of issues, and obviously one of the ways in which those entrepreneurial ecosystems are being promoted is through things like training and finance and, deploying information technology. But one of the aspects of all of that we felt wasn't getting as much attention was this idea of advice. And we started to think, actually, advice is quite an anthropological subject, because it's about people sitting down, communicating, having a relationship with each other where they're trying to establish and clarify meaning. And so there are all sorts of interesting cultural dimensions to advice giving. And we started to think perhaps advice needs to be made more visible as a subject in the entrepreneurship support work that's going on. So I suppose one of our main objectives with this research was to make the subject of advice more visible, to somehow surface it as a subject for discussion, and critical discussion and practical discussion about how do we improve it. And we thought, well, how do we do that? First thing would be to try to map out and understand who gives advice and to whom, and maybe to learn something about the usefulness of that advice. But then the second important thing, and you've already touched on this in your introduction, is who is excluded from this? Who is actually getting access to advice and who isn't? And what are the kinds of issues there, and perhaps what could be done about that? And what can we learn from advice relationships that already exist that could be used to try to overcome some of that? So we put together a research proposal, a research project, and we managed to get a little bit of research money from from my university, from the London School of Economics, which has something called the International Inequalities Institute, which is a research institute at London School of Economics, and they have a program called the Atlantic Philanthropies Program. And the Atlantic Philanthropies Program is a program that brings people, change makers from different parts of the world, to do a kind of practical master's discussion, and it's funded by some outside, money, and we wanted, every so often they make small grants available to do work that might be supportive of these issues of, on the one hand, social entrepreneurship and change, and on the other, issues of inequality. So our project is very much linked in with that. And we decided to look at these issues in two countries, so in Bangladesh, but also in Sri Lanka. And we're working with BRAC in Bangladesh as a partner there with their Promoting Business Incubation for Small Entrepreneurs, the PROMISE program. And in Sri Lanka, we're working with partners in something called the Centre for a Smart Future, which is a think tank that's concerned with these issues in Colombo. So that's what we're doing. That's some of the background to the project. And we're nearing the closing stages of the project now, where we're starting to think much more about how do we disseminate our lessons, how do we continue these conversations. And so doing this podcast is a fantastic way for us to to build, new relationships and to communicate these ideas.
Yeah, thanks. So like the entire Advicescape is quite diverse, like different players are already there. So the information that I got from the website that is already live is that there is another aspect, like urban versus rural Advicescape. So will it be possible to give a few examples of the disparities that are being manifested, and their impact on the youth entrepreneurs, especially the marginalized entrepreneurs?
Yeah. I mean, perhaps before we go on to the inequality issues, which I think are really important, perhaps we should talk a little bit more back and forth about what we mean by advice and the different kinds, and then perhaps the role that entrepreneurial advice giving plays in society, and then shall we go on to the inequalities, because that's another big subject. But I think that some of the people listening to might still be thinking, what is he talking about? Advice, who are the different people? So shall we stay with the Advicescape?
Yeah, because advice has a lot of dimensions. Like we give advice in the form of consulting, in the form of mentoring, in the form of coaching. So what is advice in your lens?
Yeah. So we're casting the net very widely in terms of what we mean by advice. And we want to, first of all, make a distinction between the formal types of advice and the informal types of advice that an aspiring entrepreneur or business person might want to be interested in. So the formal type of advice is the advice that is embedded within training, within the sort of business support services, and also some of the mentoring programs that I know that, Rashid, you've been very instrumental in building and developing, and you're very strongly involved with. Sometimes advice might be voluntary, and as part of, a voluntary effort to try to provide mutual support by people with successful businesses to people maybe trying to start them. But also business might be more of a sort of advice might be more of a commercial proposition. In other words, there are now groups that are selling advice, or at least selling courses or advice opportunities and everything. So we have all of that sort of formal type of advice, but we're also quite interested in the informal advice, part of the ecosystem. So, for example, people will perhaps start with talking to family and to friends about their ideas, to people in their community. And so they might also be getting advice through these informal routes. And so we think that's also quite an important part of the picture that sometimes gets, forgotten, because if someone's getting bad advice from their immediate, family and friends, they may never get as far as taking their ideas forward. Or on the other hand, if they're getting really strong support and inspiration from people, then that's going to be quite a big factor in moving things forward that might then catapult them into the more formal world of advice, where they might be able to, get access to more specialist things. Mm-hmm. So, the more that we thought about advice, the more we thought, hey, this is a really interesting subject. It's quite a diverse thing, and it's an important ingredient into any kind of economic activity or entrepreneurial activity that perhaps doesn't get as much attention as it should. And of course, there are other issues around advice, which is that, it may be demand driven. In other words, it may be that somebody is looking for advice to try to solve a problem, but it might sometimes be supply driven, in that people are being encouraged to go into training sessions, perhaps by NGOs or something, and given lots of advice, but it might not be entirely matched to people's needs. Mm-hmm. So I think that's another quite interesting subject around the supply and demand, and is the advice any good? Is it needed? Is it wanted? Is it effective? And so, advice is is a complex bundle of information, judgments, problem diagnoses, relationships. So it's a very interesting subject, I think, to try and dig into.
Yeah, so there are like quite a number of interesting aspects that you have touched upon. Is like, if we analyze the entire advice-scape, there can be multiple ways to think about it, like formal versus informal, demand-driven versus supply-driven, then
Hmm.
good versus bad. So in the process of giving advice, since we are very much invested into giving voluntary advice to our entrepreneurs, what we have seen that uh, one of the core fundamentals of advice is the trust, having that trust and that vulnerability in the entire process. Because let's say you are giving me some kind of advice. If I don't have that, at least a minimum level of trust on you, the entire process of like having advice actually doesn't work in the long term. And again, another thing is that what's in it for you? The question that repeatedly comes up. Let's say some like all of our mentors are volunteer mentors. So at times we have come across people who says, "What's in it for me?" So during your research, have you? I know you have talked to a lot of mentors, a lot of entrepreneurs. So what were mentors' viewpoint? Like those who were in the business of giving business advice. So what was their viewpoint?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's so interesting because there are positive roles for advice and there are perhaps some less positive or risks associated with it as well. And, the positive roles are that obviously it's an ingredient into building a successful business so that it could be, it could make the difference between an enterprise, succeeding or an enterprise running into problems and, really going wrong. And there's another positive thing, which is that potentially advice, as you say, builds trust and it perhaps contributes more widely to more of a kind of trusting community, society. So there might be these wider benefits, but as you're also saying, there are some problems, and there are some perhaps less positive aspects to it. And one of them might be that that it can be quite self-interested. If we're talking about business and we're talking about someone who is kind of starting out, talking to a more experienced person, well, first of all, there are possible conflicts of interest around competition and trade secrets, if you like. So certainly there are mentors or advice givers who might provide advice that is not necessarily as objective as we would like it to be. But I think, you asked about, do advice givers, what are their experiences? And I mean, sometimes I think advice givers will make judgments and they might be a little bit critical of people who are perhaps not sufficiently listening to their advice or not sufficiently being sort of business-minded enough or objective about, what they're doing. So there are definitely some potential conflicts or tensions in advice relationships as well. People who receive advice can sometimes be, they can sometimes be in a situation where they feel that they're not being listened to enough. So although they are, in theory, getting advice, the advice is not achieving a good match with what their problems are. So, and I suppose that ties into the mixed motivations for people getting advice, getting involved in advice giving. If it's commercial, it might be that they simply want to, sell as much advice as possible. But if it's voluntary, it might just be that they want to talk about their experiences as much as possible, but not necessarily spend time understanding the person getting the advice. So, all of those things I think are interesting. I mean, I think entrepreneurial advice giving also plays a wider role in in a society, which is that it's also reinforcing the idea of the entrepreneur as an important and a powerful sort of figure in society. And I think that's a very good thing, but it can also feed into this idea of the entrepreneurial hero as being the only person in society that is really important. And I think we would probably also want to step back from that a little bit and to make sure that we are realistic about what can be achieved and what perhaps can't.
Like another important point that you have mentioned is that the matching, like how, like a mentee is matched to a mentor, or a person is reaching out to whom. Let's say if someone is reaching out to me and I only understand, let's say, the digital marketing part of the business, I don't have any other business apart from doing the digital marketing. So it's like I have the only tool to help an entrepreneur, and whoever comes, I will keep saying that, hey, do the digital marketing, do this. Probably digital marketing is not the thing that is applicable for that business. So understanding a business takes quite a lot of time. So according to your study, how do you tackle this thing? Let's see, if you're giving consulting, it takes almost probably 20 to 30 minutes or an hour to understand my business, and how you can actually scale this process of giving advice, and how, let's say, someone from a semi-urban or rural area can get those advice. And I'm excluding the fact that there are a lot of free advice available in YouTube, the Facebook communities, because that is a different ballgame. If I want to understand what kind of advice is useful from the YouTube and the social media, I believe I need a particular skill set to filter those advices. So what do you think? How we can actually scale the entire advice giving process? As we understand, like, there are a lot of young people who are getting into entrepreneurship, or who want to get into entrepreneurship, but they don't have that, I'll say, more of an effective or scalable advice mechanism.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. So in a way, I mean, that leads us into thinking about these different inequalities, and certainly young people are one of the focuses of our project. So I mean, I think we are recognizing that there are these inequalities in the Advicescapes around a number of different things. One of them is around youth and young people getting access to good advice. Another one is the urban-rural divide, which I think is important. Another one is the gendered issues of advice and the whole issue around women's access to not just advice, but also to the wider opportunities of business through financing and trading and and technical stuff. And then another, of course, is the issue of minorities, who might find themselves with less access to particular opportunities that the mainstream society may have. And I guess all of those different axes of Advicescape inequality are things that we've been considering. And we recently had this workshop in Dhaka, which you were at, and we talked about these issues amongst advice givers and advice takers. And we did the same thing as well in a workshop a few months ago in Colombo in Sri Lanka. And so one of the things we thought, and that participants thought would be useful, would be to come out with some principles of good advice in order to raise the profile of advice, and in order to try and improve, make it better quality, but also to make it more inclusive when there are certain principles. And we went through some of these things around things like meeting people where they are, so that rather than requiring people to make journeys or to go into unfamiliar environments, particularly people who live in more, more remote places. We have this principle of, listening and being heard, principles around sensitivity to difference, recognizing shared experience, also keeping advice embedded in longer term and continuous relationships. So not seeing advice as just a one-off moment. I mean, there might be situations in which advice is needed for a one-off problem or for some particular question, but people also seem to feel that having advice relationships where you could build up that trust and you could build up that listening was a key thing. So thinking about all of those principles of advice seemed to be a good place to start. But I think one of the other things that we've learned is that when we're thinking about entrepreneurship in the context of Sri Lanka and Bangladesh, we are talking about more than one different sort of scenario. And broadly speaking, it seemed to me that there are two of these main areas of the Advicescape. One of them is if you like, the sort of startup world, which is receiving a lot of attention from government and from private finance, but is mainly urban focused and is quite sort of well resourced and is very kind of dynamic at the moment. But there's another area of entrepreneurship, which is more in the informal economy, in rural areas outside of Dhaka, and is much more focused around, what one might call the sort of needs economy. In other words, it's about households who are trying to start or run businesses in order to support basic household livelihoods, obviously trying to grow and trying to expand as well. And that's a domain that has traditionally been very much supported through sort of government skills programs, but also through NGO skill training and loans and small business support, entrepreneurship support. But I think those two worlds are not really very connected up, and that some of the inequalities in the system are reproduced in those two worlds. So, for example, although the government is doing a lot to support startups, it's very Dhaka focused, and those resources are not necessarily being accessed by people outside, rural or small towns. There are these sort of disparities in the Advicescape. Now, what we do about that, of course, is, it's difficult. I think it's actually very tough. But I think that the first thing that we can do is to highlight these and to think about, how we make a stronger case for more inclusive Advicescape.
Yeah. So this is another point, another critical point actually. For the startup that you were saying is that those are more innovation led, and those have got more of a regional. I would say the country focus or the more of a regional focus, as opposed to the small medium enterprises or cottage and small all those CMSMEs, SMEs. So those are more of a community driven. So I believe while it is important to talk about the different worlds, it is also important to identify what are the differences between these two kind of enterprises, because these two have different funding requirement. These two have got different business model. So it is also important for the entrepreneurs themselves to understand in which game they are in, because these are two different games. Once they understand this, they will be able to reach out to more people, those kind of people who are in a position to support them. Because if someone is giving advice in the innovation-driven enterprises or let's say startups, they may not be suitable to give advice for those SMEs and the vice versa. So yeah, this is very important to highlight the differences and how we can, I would say, bridge the best practices of both of the worlds. Because what we have seen in last 2 years, especially after COVID, the startups have got a lot of best practices that can be probably replicated in small businesses as well. And the day-to-day survival where there's like no such fund is available and everything for small businesses, there are certain principles that can also be helpful for those startups. So I believe there is a role that's our institution or the government or some other actors can play in bridging this gap. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a really important insight. And I think we have to recognize that all sectors, government and business and NGOs all have roles to play in this, and that we should really be thinking about what these different roles are. I think for government, it's really important that the conditions under which entrepreneurship is undertaken are provided in a stable and inclusive way. And that means in challenging the urban-rural, but I think it also means recognizing more space for civil society, for more inclusive local institutions and organizations and relationships, and challenging maybe some of the narrower sort of patronage models that that are out there. But I think from an NGO point of view, one of the things that can be done there is to play a role in reaching hard to reach parts of society on the one hand, but on the other hand also advocating for those groups or with those groups to try to change things. And it reminds me a little bit of a long time ago in the 80s and 90s in Bangladesh. I was studying agriculture, and I was studying how the government's agricultural extension services to farmers were very biased towards the larger farmers, and they were not providing useful advice to the very large numbers of very small and marginal farmers in rural areas. And that was one of the justifications that justified the growth of NGOs. In other words, NGOs like GRAC and Kushika and all of these organizations, they started saying, actually, we need to support more farmers. We need to support the government is not really, it's too locked into the large farmer relationships, and it's providing all kinds of loans and tech to those farmers, and they're doing fine, and their agricultural businesses and their farms are growing, but all of these other marginal people are not getting any access to services. And what NGOs did, they came along and said, let's raise the profile. Let's start working with small farmers. Let's listen to what they have to say about their needs. And let's think about developing programs and forms of support that can help them, but that we shouldn't just be filling in the gaps. We should also be putting pressure on government to say, look, you've got to change the way that you go about things. And so perhaps I think there's the same kind of argument that can be made about this, which is that, civil society groups and NGOs need to be critical friends. They need to, on the one hand, provide services and meet these needs and fill these gaps, but they also should be critically, befriending, government and powerful people, those in power, to try to say, look, you need to improve this. There are problems here. But that, that's why, that's one way that I would look at this. Sort of civil society is important for challenging inequality.
Yes, and I believe that another aspect that we need to factor in is that for last few years, government has been really focusing on developing entrepreneurship, especially among the young people, because we understand there's a large bunch of young people out there, and the economy is not in a position to create enough jobs for them. So there is another option so that they can, the young people can become the job creators. So, once government has started giving this push, there are different government institutions, NGOs who were never into entrepreneurship. They have come into the entrepreneurship space, giving trainings and all that stuff. But the gap we personally have felt is that there are young people who want to start a business. Like they said, they have an idea, and or they have at least an inspiration to do something on their own. So moving from inspiration to idea, from idea to get into operational stage, there is a large gap in the support system, which help them to turn their idea into reality. As opposed to, there are a lot of operational MSMEs, CMSMEs. So they are getting some sort of support. So did you come across such cases where young people are starting the idea phase and they are not getting enough advice, quote unquote, and help to start their own entrepreneurial journey?
Yeah. No, I think that's an interesting point. I mean, I think one of the things that we did come across was examples of people, young people, who are certainly being encouraged in this area, and but perhaps being given unrealistic encouragement, in the sense of saying, look, you can do this, you can set up a business, it's a great thing to do, you can succeed, but without really being realistic about what the odds are about how to succeed, and that only a small number of these startups can actually succeed. And we heard interesting accounts. For example, in some of the universities, there are a lot of student startup competitions and schemes where the winners will win some financing and some advice and some support, and then being very disillusioned when that doesn't necessarily immediately translate into a business success. So I think there's an issue about people being sold an unrealistic picture of what being an entrepreneur means and what a startup might offer. And somehow I think, getting that balance right between inspiring people to be creative and to think creatively, but also to remind people that this is not a magic wand that can somehow, remove some of the blockages and the difficulties that exist in the economy and in society. So, I think I don't know whether that speaks to your point a little bit. And and I think that, perhaps what we need is to think about, a more realistic view of entrepreneurship that is perhaps somehow combining those two different parts of the Advicescape that we talked about. On the one hand, there are aspects of the sort of small scale, very heavily supported business that we might talk about in that needs economy or in the rural small town thing. And then there's the very highly supported but slightly unrealistic startup mythology that's very powerful at the moment and risks diverting, I think, a lot of young people from a notion of a much more realistic idea that, look, good businesses need to have, a good, stable legal environment. They need to have high levels of trust in the society. They need to have good government support in order to create the playing field in which, business operates. And so we need, I think, to recognize that all of these three sectors have a part to play in making sure that there's a good environment for business.
Yeah, I totally agree, because the way for the past probably 1.5 years, we have transitioned from giving support to larger scale youth to focus more of those kind of youth to whom our resource will be best utilized. Because what we understand that all the organizations are going through a resource limitation. The resource will always be limited. So it is in our best interest we find those kind of youth that have got that enterprising mindset, that have got the potential, the urge, and as well as the skill set. We can work on the skill set, but those needs to be matched with the business model as well as the ecosystem. So there are three blocks of things that I believe should go hand in hand, like the personal strength, the business that they are trying to build, and the ecosystem. Does the ecosystem support the whole thing? If there is no supporting legal environment, policy environment, you can come up with an excellent idea, but that will fall flat on your face. So this kind of realistic check is not sweet all the time, because people don't want to listen. Hey, I'm sorry, but this may not work in next 1.5 years. What are the alternatives? So it is also very important for both the organizations, the advice givers, as well as the entrepreneurs to be open about the reality. This was very important. And talking about the reality,
there's maybe an educational dimension to all of this as well, which is that the quality and access to good education, and perhaps the inclusion of issues like this more into the curriculum, is also going to be part of giving people the critical skills and the mindset that will enable them to make good decisions and to balance different factors in their decision making. So I think that's important too.
Yeah, and I believe entrepreneurship has been equated to, or the word startup itself has been equated to the celebritism. If you are a startup CEO, so you are sort of or almost have become a celebrity. No, it's not necessarily the case, even if you fundraise, because I have talked to a number of people who have successfully raised millions of funds, even in the startup, and they keep saying, we have got a lot of sleepless night, because the fundraising is just one part of the entire game. Even it is the tiny portion of the game. You have to run operations. You have to solve a problem day-to-day basis. So education, I believe, will play a big role in the entire ecosystem development, as well as how we talk to different people, especially the young people. Because in our case, such things have happened. The number of young people have come, they have shared their idea, and after doing analysis, going back and forth, we had to say, hey, why do you think with your skill set, won't you be better suited for a job for the time being, and you gain experiences and they start with side hustle. So there are people who are doing tremendous after going through this process. So the point that I'm trying to emphasize, and which I believe we have also talked before, is that we cannot be binary, either yes or no. There are a lot of other ways to build an enterprise.
Yeah. No, I think that's absolutely right. We have to have diverse approaches, and we have to recognize, the different kinds of, the different kinds of skills. I mean, there's another quite interesting point. I remember reading something a few years ago. I think it was from the Harvard Business School, about what they call triple strength leadership, and this idea that it's quite good for people who are in positions of perhaps starting businesses to have had some varied career experiences so that they actually have some understanding of, for example, perhaps some time working in a government organization, or perhaps some time working in an NGO type organization. That if you're going to have a realistic set of aspirations, getting different kinds of work experience can probably be quite a useful thing for setting up a business, And in the same way, somebody who wants to perhaps become a longer term sort of government employee, it does them no harm at all to have had some experience understanding what it's like working in an NGO or in a private sector organization, because there are all kinds of lessons that one can learn across these different sectors.
Yes. And it also brings us to a point that one of your focal point of the study is that the intersection among the religion, caste, ethnicity, and gender. And regarding the gender part of the whole thing, so in many cases we have seen, like, especially for the female entrepreneur, they have been said that, hey, you are a female, you can't start a business and it's too difficult for you. The people won't support you. And there are like societal pressure, there are pressure from the peer group, there are pressure even from the families, like the old family members. So what do you think, how, let's say, for an NGO like us, for other NGOs who are operating in this sector, how we can support them in the best manner?
Yeah, I mean, there are these different areas of inequality, and gender is certainly a really important one. And this is something that our partners at BRAC in the Promise program have been very concerned by. And, Tasmia Upper has been really sort of pushing this. And I think they're arguing very strongly that there has to be both changes at the level of individual women entrepreneurs who might have ideas and who might feel discouraged, but also changes in the mindset more widely. In other words, in society around the importance of that underutilized resource of, women entrepreneurs. And I think there's been quite a lot that's being achieved in that. And in fact, in the workshop, you'll remember that we were encouraging people to talk about some of their experiences and to, document that. And on our research project website, which hopefully you can put the link up there at the end of this podcast. But if people are interested, they can have a look at some of these short videos in which people talk about some of their experiences. And in both Sri Lanka and in Bangladesh, there are some interesting accounts by younger women about how they have tried to struggle to get their business established. And in some cases, it's come from initially in the family, that trying to find, they had some family members who were trying to discourage them, but then finding a family member who was much more supportive and trying to build those relationships, and then to get the support to move out into a more formal, for example, an NGO training in which they can start their journey into setting up a business with more technical information and training. So I think, there's both an individual level and a more public awareness level that, that organizations need to keep pushing out. Because I think in the end, it's, I think people respond very favorably to successful entrepreneurship, whether it's younger people, older people, male, female. It's just the getting there that I think is really difficult.
True. So I guess,
but we also had groups. I mean, we also had some people at the workshop who came from the so-called Bihari community, in Dhaka, who were just talking as a minority population, how little access they felt they were getting to some of the ordinary advice opportunities that exist for people, in the mainstream population. And so I think there are also some really important lessons and insights that need to be drawn there as well around inequalities, not just around gender, but also around minority groups.
Yeah, this is a very critical point, discussing about the minority. I believe your study should be just the beginning of touching into these critical points, because minority has long been excluded from the entire support system in many ways. And when we talk about entrepreneurship, as you said, is that we want to see the success model. We want to hear the success stories, but behind one success stories, probably there are thousands other failure stories, and there are a lot of struggles. What I believe is that those struggles need to be visible for the people who want to get into this journey. I keep saying that entrepreneurship is not a job or something; it's an identity. So if I want to embrace this identity, I want to be sure whether this identity is a good fit for me, and whether I am really in a position to take the opportunity cost, because taking up this entire identity always comes up with a lot of opportunity cost. Probably I can be deluded by the fancy things that being promoted, not just in Bangladesh, but also globally, like $4 million, that he has become a millionaire, she has become a billionaire, all that stuff. But this needs to be really grounded. And I believe that your study will play a critical role, especially for the excluded people, to get that realistic picture. So finally, as we wrap up, what will be your actionable recommendations for the non-profits who are in the pathway to give really, I would say, effective advice to the excluded young community and want to make their lives a better one from the current, wherever they sit right now?
Yeah, no, thank you, Rashid. I think, what we're trying to do with the project is to build this conversation, and I think that we don't necessarily have concrete recommendations yet. What we have are, what we're proposing to do, and we're starting to build this up, is what we're calling an advice toolkit. In other words, we want to raise the profile of advice as a subject, and then we want to provide some preliminary tools that we think can help to support the role of advice within these entrepreneurship ecosystems. So one of them will be these guidelines around good advice, so the principles of good advice. And we have started to think about how we might visualize some of those through some visual materials. And in Sri Lanka at the moment, we have some graphics being designed, which we hope could make these principles really accessible and could find their way into some local government offices and some NGO offices, and maybe some small businesses as well, where they can be used to try to have conversations about advice and to raise its profile. And if that's successful, I think we might try and do something similar as well in Bangladesh, where we can have these visual tools translated. And so we've got that. And then we've also got these short videos where we have invited people to speak very briefly just about some of their experiences, so that we hope that people could learn from some of that, and that these videos can prompt conversations and insights around the importance of advice. And then I think we hope, your point actually is really interesting, and it's making me think that we were also thinking of having some very small entrepreneurship stories there as well that could also provide insight for people. And I think, as you were saying, we sort of have to find a way, don't we, to also have entrepreneurship failure stories made visible so that we can learn lessons from them. Because I think we almost learn more from understanding what goes wrong than we do with, just only focusing on entrepreneurship success. So advice, trying to feed that into advice, I think, and maybe that's something we can talk more about. I mean, I very much also like your mentoring sort of guidelines, the document that I know that you've been working on. And so one of our other aims with the project is to link up with organizations like yours and some of the activities that you're doing, and to provide any kind of support or insights that we can as well, that can also be part of this toolkit. So people will visit our advice toolkit and our website in order to continue this advice discussion.
Yeah, I believe probably the most important part that this study has brought upon is that it has started a constructive conversation. It has taken into different perspectives while not being prescriptive, because this is so dynamic that we cannot be prescribed, okay, this is the solution, you go this way, all the other ways are wrong. So this is the only way that is available. So that is amazing. And I believe the failure stories, you can always consider, because since you have perspective of both Sri Lanka and Bangladesh with more or less similar economic situation, demographic situation, those failure stories are really important to surface, because otherwise a lot of young people will be getting into something that they thought it will give them a good life without understanding what it is going to happen. And it will also work as a basis for the entrepreneurship support organizations as well, how they can communicate failure, because there needs to be a delicate balance. Let's say if I am communicating failure to someone, I also need to be like sensitive and
It's because
because sometimes it will happen like, hey, every entrepreneur is a failure in that case, so I won't be get into entrepreneurship. So as you were saying, one in your toolkits, it should be explicitly mentioned that what kind of skills, at least baseline skills, should an advice giver have. In many cases, what we have seen, they're technically very sound, but they can't communicate their ideas, their experiences. So sometimes the entrepreneurs get the wrong impression about the whole thing. So this is one of the important things that I believe you will be including in your toolkit.
Absolutely. I think understanding the way to approach learning from failure, I think, is to use it to prompt discussions of, well, what could be done differently? What are the decisions that were taken that perhaps weren't realistic? And matching those case studies of failure and lessons with successful ones, because obviously one doesn't want to use failure as a way of disillusioning people. But I think one of the things that we've talked about today, and I think is a useful takeaway, is this idea that we've got to have a balance between the incredibly unrealistic expectations that are sometimes promoted, but also a realistic sense of what is possible, and the importance of trying to do things, the importance of creativity as a way forward, which I think is, remains fundamental. That's how we move societies forward, is through, being creative and thinking creatively. And the more that we can do to inspire that and to prompt it and to provide people with the tools for thinking creatively, the better.
Yeah. So yes, I just want to extend my genuine thanks to you and the entire team for the tremendous work that you were doing. Because I come across a lot of young people who are struggling to a varying degrees due to the unavailability of the effective advice mechanism. And I do strongly believe that your work will contribute to this area, and help organizations like ours to build up like a scalable advice mechanism that will contribute to a better economy and better lives for our young people. So thank you very much, David.
Well, thank you, Rashid, for the work that you do and for giving me this opportunity to talk about our work. And I look forward very much to continuing our conversations and our work on this. You've really helped to clarify a lot of the ideas that we've been thinking about over the course of this project, and we look forward very much to continuing collaboration.